Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss, the most painful act of treachery in history. A kiss that should have meant loyalty and devotion became the signal that delivered the Son of God into his enemy's hands. It wasn't an enemy with a sword who struck the first blow that night. It was a friend with a gesture of love twisted into betrayal. Before we go deeper, if you believe in Jesus, hit subscribe right now and type faith in the comments. The Lord Jesus is with you, and in him we are never alone. And while you're here, tell me where you're watching from and the exact time right now. It's incredible to see this community of believers gathered across the world. Now step into the Garden of Gethsemane. It's past midnight. The city of Jerusalem lies silent, but the garden is alive with tension. The air is thick, cool, almost heavy, as if even the olive trees are holding their breath. You hear the quiet scrape of cloth against stone as Jesus kneels to pray. His voice trembles, not out of weakness, but out of the unimaginable weight pressing down on him. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. The disciples sit only a short distance away, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They want to stay awake, to stand watch, but their bodies betray them. They drift into restless sleep, unaware that history is already turning in the shadows. Their master bleeds in prayer, while his friends snore softly nearby. It's almost ironic. He's awake to bear the world's burden, while they can't keep their eyes open for even an hour. Then suddenly silence is broken. At first it's faint, boots crunching on gravel, the rustle of a crowd. Then you see the torches, orange flames flickering in the darkness, weaving between the olive trees. A band of soldiers emerges, armed with swords and clubs, faces set with determination. Behind them, officials from the chief priests murmur orders. The sound of authority and violence moving as one. And leading them, Judas Iscariot. He doesn't creep or cower. He walks with confidence, as if nothing is out of place. To anyone watching from a distance, he looks like a man guiding friends to his master, and in a way he is, but the guidance is poison. Judas knows the plan. He has arranged the signal. A kiss, simple and ordinary, will mark Jesus as the one to seize. Mainstream fact. In first-century Jewish culture, a kiss was not just a casual greeting. It was a sign of respect between a disciple and his teacher, a way of acknowledging authority with affection. That is why this act was so loaded. Judas turned the most intimate gesture of honor into a weapon of betrayal. Jesus rises as the crowd closes in. The disciples stir awake, confusion flashing across their faces. Swords are drawn in panic, adrenaline surges, but before anyone can act, Judas steps forward. He greets his teacher with warmth. He leans in close, and he kisses him. It should have been the kiss of devotion. Instead, it becomes the kiss of death. And here's a quirky detail. Medieval plays often exaggerated this scene, portraying Judas's kiss as fiery or even venomous, as if it left a mark of evil on Jesus's face. Painters through the centuries made Judas look grotesque, bulging eyes, twisted features, a face warped by sin. Of course, we don't know what Judas really looked like, but it shows how unforgettable and loathsome that kiss became in the imagination of later generations. But pause here. Why a kiss? Why not point or shout? Historians still debate this. Some argue Judas chose a kiss to ensure no mistake. Jesus was often surrounded by disciples, and in the dark chaos of the garden, soldiers might have grabbed the wrong man. Others suggest Judas used the kiss precisely because it would sting deeper. A shout could mark Jesus. A kiss would wound him. And still others believe the kiss wasn't Judas's idea at all, but demanded by the priests, who wanted the betrayal to carry maximum humiliation. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The soldiers seized Jesus immediately, chains rattling as they bound him. The disciples panicked. One, in a burst of desperation, lashed out with a sword, cutting off a servant's ear. But Jesus, even in the moment of betrayal, reached out and healed the wound of his enemy. Imagine that. The last miracle before the cross was an act of mercy towards someone come to arrest him. And then came the words. Not shouted, not snarled, but spoken with sorrow. Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? That question lingers like a dagger. It wasn't just an accusation, it was grief in words. Jesus wasn't surprised. He had known this moment was coming. But knowing doesn't make it hurt less. Betrayal always cuts deeper when it comes from a friend. Think about the disciples in that moment. For years they had traveled together, shared bread, endured storms, witnessed wonders. Judas wasn't some shadowy outsider. He was family, and in a single act, he shattered that trust forever. The soldiers dragged Jesus away, and the disciples scattered like frightened sheep. Fear, shame, confusion, it all hung thick in the night air, and at the heart of it was one man's kiss. Judas's act wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, intimate, and unforgettable. That's why it has echoed for centuries. Wars have been fought, kings have been toppled, revolutions have risen and fallen, but betrayal is universal. Every culture, every age understands the sting of being sold out by someone you trust. That's why Judas's kiss still feels fresh, even 2,000 years later. And here's where the story tightens its grip on us. Betrayal isn't just about Judas. Haven't we all felt a Judas in our lives? A friend who turned away, a promise broken, a trust shattered? That's why this moment in Gethsemane doesn't just belong to history. It belongs to every heart that has ever known betrayal. But here's the difference. In most stories, betrayal ends with bitterness. In this one, betrayal became the doorway to salvation. Judas's kiss didn't derail God's plan. It fulfilled it. What he meant for treachery, heaven turned into triumph. So, as we step deeper into this story, remember this. The darkest act of betrayal became the spark for the brightest act of love. That's why Judas's kiss still matters, because it shows us that even when trust is shattered, God's purpose cannot be broken. And this is only the beginning. When most people hear the name Judas, one word comes to mind: traitor. His very name has become shorthand for betrayal. Yet before the infamous kiss, before the silver, before his name became a curse, Judas was simply another disciple. A man chosen by Jesus himself. That fact alone complicates the story. Out of all the men he could have picked, the Son of God invited Judas into his inner circle, which makes us ask, who was Judas really? Let's start with the basics. Judas Iscariot, his surname likely referring to his hometown, Kerioth, was one of the 12. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't a spy from the Pharisees. He walked with Jesus for years. He saw the miracles. He witnessed Lazarus rise from the tomb. He watched blind eyes open. He ate bread multiplied out of thin air. Judas wasn't blind to who Jesus was. He was in the thick of it. Mainstream fact: Judas was trusted enough to be given responsibility. He was the treasurer of the group, the one who held the common purse. That tells us two things. He was literate, and the disciples saw him as capable of managing money. Ironically, the man who handled their donations became the one who sold them out for the cheapest price. Now let's pull in one of those quirky tidbits. Some apocryphal texts suggest Judas wasn't just handling coins. He was also a skilled negotiator. A few fringe writings even claim Judas managed deals for lodging and food during their travels. If that's true, it means Judas wasn't just the money guy. He may have been the organizer, the practical one keeping the mission on track behind the scenes. That only makes his betrayal sting more. So why did he do it? Was he greedy? Some argue Judas was simply corrupted by the love of money. 30 pieces of silver was hardly a fortune, but maybe for Judas it was enough. Yet the Gospels themselves don't all agree on his motive. Matthew presents him as seeking out the chief priests directly, asking, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" That makes him sound cold, calculating. John, on the other hand, portrays Judas as greedy all along, helping himself to the disciples' purse, a thief hiding in plain sight. Luke's account shifts the blame higher, saying Satan entered Judas, making him more pawn than mastermind. And here's where the debates rage. Some theologians insist Judas was motivated by disillusionment. Perhaps he had expected Jesus to lead a rebellion against Rome, to throw off the yoke of oppression. But instead, he got a teacher who preached love, humility, and turning the other cheek. For Judas, maybe the betrayal was a protest, a way to force Jesus into showing his true power. Others take an even stranger view, suggesting Judas may have believed he was helping, pushing Jesus toward his destiny by putting events in motion. Was he a villain or a tragic instrument of prophecy? That's the uncomfortable truth. Judas wasn't a monster from the start. He was a man, chosen by Christ, trusted with responsibility, seated at the same table as Peter, John, and the rest. Which makes his fall all the more devastating. The betrayal wasn't the act of an enemy outside the circle. It was the wound from within. Think of it this way. If a stranger had turned Jesus over, no one would remember. But Judas shows us that betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from someone you thought was family. That's why his name echoes louder than Pilate's, louder than Caiaphas's, louder even than the soldiers who nailed Jesus to the cross. Those were enemies doing their job. Judas was a friend. And here's one more haunting detail. At the Last Supper, when Jesus declared that one of them would betray him, Judas was there. Imagine the unease at that table, the disciples questioning, "Is it I, Lord?" And Judas, knowing what he had already agreed to, still dipped his hand into the bowl with Jesus. That image alone chills the spine. Betrayal sitting at the table, breaking bread with God himself. So who was Judas, really? He was a disciple, a treasurer, perhaps even a pragmatist. But above all, he was a man whose choices remind us how thin the line can be between devotion and treachery, between following Christ and turning against him. Judas is not just a figure of history, he's a mirror for the weakness in every human heart. And in the end, that's what makes him unforgettable. The image is burned into history, Judas slipping into the shadows of Jerusalem to meet with the chief priests, bargaining for the life of his master. And the price? 30 pieces of silver, a sum so specific, so small, and yet so devastating that it has echoed for 2,000 years. At first glance, it almost feels insulting. 30 pieces. Not gold, not jewels. Just a handful of silver coins. Was the Son of God really worth so little? Mainstream fact. In Jewish law, 30 pieces of silver wasn't a random number. According to Exodus 21:32, it was the compensation paid to an owner if his slave was killed by an ox. Let that sink in. The life of Jesus was valued at the price of a slave's accidental death. For the priests, the number may have been symbolic, reducing Christ to the lowest possible worth. For Judas, it may have been just enough to tip the scale. Now, for a quirky detail, some historians argue that those coins weren't the typical shekels most people imagine. They may have been Tyrian shekels, minted in Phoenicia, prized for their purity of silver. Ironically, these coins were often used to pay the temple tax, meaning the very money Judas took to betray Jesus might have been drawn from funds meant for worship. Betrayal literally paid for with holy coin. But why 30? Why not more? Surely if Judas was greedy, he could have asked for a fortune, and this is where the debates swirl. Some scholars suggest Judas wasn't bargaining hard, he just wanted to be rid of Jesus, and 30 pieces was a token, not a jackpot. Others argue the priests themselves set the price deliberately, mocking both Jesus and Judas by making the reward pitiful. And then there are those who insist Judas's motive wasn't money at all. The silver was almost incidental, the betrayal already decided in his heart. And yet, money does strange things to people. The Gospels show us Judas was already dipping into the disciples' purse, skimming from the common funds. John even calls him a thief outright. So perhaps the 30 coins weren't about the amount. Perhaps it was the principle. Judas was already used to choosing silver over loyalty, and this was just the final, fatal act. But here's the haunting image: 30 coins. Not hundreds, not thousands, just enough to clink in a small bag, enough to jingle in a man's pocket, to weigh on his conscience every time he touched it, enough to remind him with every step of what he had done. And in the end, that silver didn't bring Judas satisfaction. Matthew tells us that when he saw Jesus condemned, Judas was seized with remorse. He tried to return the coins to the priests, crying, "I have betrayed innocent blood." But they laughed him off. The money had already done its work. Judas threw the silver into the temple and fled into the night. That's the chilling irony. The money wasn't wealth. It wasn't even useful. It became cursed, tainted by betrayal. The priests refused to put it in the treasury, calling it blood money. Instead, they bought a field with it, a burial place for strangers. The field of blood. To this day, the coins are remembered less as currency and more as the weight that dragged Judas's soul into despair. And here's a thought that lingers. Judas's betrayal was cheap, but betrayal usually is. People don't often sell out friends for fortunes. They do it for petty reasons, for ego, for resentment, for a quick gain. 30 pieces of silver reminds us that the price of loyalty is often shockingly small. So was Judas's betrayal about greed, or was the silver just a symbol, a way to seal a deal already made in his heart? Historians, theologians, and believers still wrestle with that question, but one thing is certain: 30 pieces of silver was never really about the money. It was about the cost of a soul, and Judas paid dearly for his bargain. If money wasn't enough to explain Judas's betrayal, then what was? 30 pieces of silver might have sealed the deal, but the heart behind it remains one of history's deepest mysteries. Why would a man who walked with Jesus for 3 years, who saw miracles firsthand, who broke bread at his side, decide to hand him over? The simplest explanation is greed. Some Gospels emphasize this. Judas loved money, helped himself to the disciples' funds, and saw Jesus as a failed investment. In this view, the betrayal was the inevitable end for a man more interested in silver than salvation. But greed alone feels thin. After all, Judas didn't live to enjoy that money. He threw it back in horror once the weight of what he'd done sank in. If wealth was his goal, he got only regret. So maybe it was disillusionment. Many Jews in the first century expected a Messiah who would overthrow Rome, restore Israel's glory, and lead a political revolution. Perhaps Judas thought he had joined that movement, but Jesus preached love, forgiveness, and a kingdom not of this world. For a man hoping for swords and crowns, that message might have been a crushing disappointment. Maybe handing Jesus over was his way of forcing action. If Jesus was truly the Messiah, surely he would rise up when threatened. But if not, Judas would expose him as a fraud. Quirky detail: some early texts even suggest Judas thought he was helping. In the so-called Gospel of Judas, a later controversial account, he is portrayed not as villain, but as the one disciple who understood Jesus' mission. In that telling, Judas wasn't betraying, he was obeying, setting events in motion so prophecy could be fulfilled. Of course, the Church rejected this text as heresy, but its very existence shows how unsettled people have always been about Judas's role. And then there's the darkest interpretation, that Judas was not acting on his own at all. Luke's Gospel says Satan entered into Judas, making him an instrument of evil rather than a mastermind. This idea places Judas in a tragic light, a man overtaken by forces larger than himself, condemned to infamy for something beyond his control. So which is it? Was Judas greedy, disappointed, manipulated, or tragically obedient? The truth may lie in a mix of all these motives. Human decisions rarely come from one cause alone. Pride, greed, fear, and confusion can intertwine until betrayal feels inevitable. And here's where the debates heat up. Some theologians argue Judas had no choice, that prophecy demanded betrayal, and he was merely a piece on God's chessboard. Others argue the opposite. Judas acted freely, and his choice shows the terrifying depth of human sin. If it was destiny, then Judas was doomed from the start. If it was choice, then he could have chosen differently. Either way, the outcome was the same: a kiss, a chain, a cross. What makes Judas so haunting is that he's not a distant monster. He was close, he was trusted, he was a disciple. And if betrayal can come from within Jesus' circle, it reminds us how fragile loyalty can be in any circle. The real tragedy? Judas didn't live to see what his betrayal led to. He died in despair, convinced his act was unforgivable. Yet the story of the cross shows us that even betrayal was swallowed up in redemption. The same blood he betrayed was poured out for him too. Judas's motives may remain a mystery, but his legacy is clear. His name is etched into history as the symbol of betrayal. Not because we fully understand him, but because his act resonates with the universal fear that even those closest to us can turn, and sometimes we ourselves might be capable of the same. Judas's story didn't end in the garden, and it didn't end with 30 coins clinking in his hand. His legacy echoes far beyond that night in Gethsemane. Across centuries, across cultures, and across the very language we speak, his name became the definition of betrayal. Say Judas, and you don't need to explain further. Everyone knows. Everyone feels the sting. The Gospels give us two versions of his death, both equally haunting. Matthew tells us Judas, seized by remorse, returned the silver to the priests. When they brushed him off, he threw the coins into the temple and went away, hanging himself in despair. The book of Acts, however, paints a different ending. Judas bought a field with the silver, but met a gruesome death there, his body bursting open. Two stories, one truth. Judas died under the crushing weight of guilt. Mainstream fact. The field purchased with Judas's silver became infamous. Known as Akeldama, the field of blood, it was used as a burial ground for foreigners. Even geography bore his mark. To this day, pilgrims in Jerusalem can visit the place long associated with betrayal and despair. Now here's a quirky tidbit. For centuries during Holy Week, some cultures burned effigies of Judas. In parts of Latin America, boys stuffed straw figures of Judas with fireworks and set them alight, watching the traitor go up in flames. In Europe, Judas effigies were hanged, stoned, or torn apart in public rituals. People weren't content to let his betrayal sit quietly in Scripture. They wanted to reenact their hatred for him, year after year, as if punishing him again might ease the pain of his kiss. But beyond ritual and folklore lies a debate that still unsettles theologians today. Was Judas doomed from the start? Was his betrayal written in prophecy, his choices locked in by divine design? Or did he have a choice, just like Peter did when he denied Christ 3 times? If Judas was merely a pawn, then his story feels cruel, like destiny trapped him. But if he had free will, then he squandered one of the greatest honors imaginable, walking with the Son of God. And that makes his decision all the more tragic. Even his motives are debated endlessly. Was it greed, disillusionment, a desperate attempt to force Jesus' hand? Or was he, as some fringe texts claim, convinced he was helping to fulfill prophecy? The mystery of Judas is that no single answer satisfies. Perhaps that's why his story has such staying power. It's not neat, it's messy, human, unresolved. And then there's the question of forgiveness. Could Judas have been forgiven if he had returned, if he had fallen at Jesus' feet after the resurrection and begged for mercy? Some believe yes. After all, Peter denied Christ, and yet Peter was restored. Others say Judas's despair showed he had no faith left, that he could not bring himself to believe forgiveness was possible. His tragedy wasn't just the betrayal, but the despair that followed. He could not imagine a grace big enough to cover his sin. That despair is part of his legacy. Judas became the cautionary tale of what happens when guilt eclipses hope. His story warns us that betrayal can destroy not just relationships, but souls, if it drives us away from mercy rather than toward it. Literature and art kept his memory alive in ways that were both chilling and symbolic. Dante, in his Inferno, placed Judas in the very lowest circle of hell, trapped in ice, chewed forever in Satan's jaws. Painters often portrayed him as grotesque, twisted, even animalistic, as if evil had reshaped his very face. Musicians gave him dark minor chords that echoed treachery. For 2,000 years, Judas was more than a man. He became a symbol, the embodiment of treason itself. But here's the haunting twist. Judas isn't just a symbol. He was real, a man with a voice, a face, a laugh, a place at the table, a man who could have been remembered as a faithful disciple. Instead, his choice became his legacy. That's why his story resonates. It's not about an abstract villain. It's about the fragile line every human walks between loyalty and betrayal. So what do we take from Judas's legacy? That betrayal is universal. That sometimes the deepest wounds come not from enemies, but from friends. That even those closest to the truth can choose against it. And that despair, if left unchecked, can silence hope. And yet, his story also forces us to reflect on something bigger. Judas's betrayal didn't stop God's plan. It didn't end the mission. If anything, it set it in motion. The kiss in the garden led to the cross, and the cross led to salvation. Even the darkest act in history could not derail divine love. Judas's betrayal was tragic, but it became the pathway to redemption for the world. That's the paradox of Judas. His name is cursed, but his act was absorbed into God's greater plan. His story warns us about betrayal, but it also whispers about grace. The very blood he betrayed was poured out for him too, even if he never accepted it. And now, I'll leave you with this question. If you had stood in the garden that night, would you have clung to Jesus, or would you have scattered into the shadows? That question is why Judas's story still matters. It's not just about him, it's about us. Before you go, let me ask you one thing. If you believe in Jesus, hit subscribe right now. Together, we can carry his light further and remind the world that where Judas chose betrayal, we choose faith.